Welcome back, everyone. I'm the Battle Gamer, and today we got a really good archetype, and this is the second time I've had to film this because I got a very fundamental rule wrong, but I'm learning. I learned because now I'm going to present it to you with the right rules rather than just hand waving and being like, meh, everyone makes mistakes. So, you're welcome. But before we get into this build, I just want to say thank you all so much for watching these videos. It's meant a lot to me. For those who are liking and subscribing, it does mean a lot. The channel's been growing very well. And as well, our Discord has been popping off. We've got all kinds of great events coming up, and we got people making games and all kinds of really great stuff. So if you're interested in any of that, please check it out down in the description below. Or if you want something a little less committal, just follow me over on Twitter, where I try my best to interact and as well post about things that are happening on the channel. But today we're going to be talking about a very fun build that is still really good despite my misunderstanding of a rule, and I really do like this build a lot, and honestly I'm growing to like this class more and more. And today's video, I mean, you already know, we're doing an Inventor build. This one I've named the Steelwire Sentinel. The Steelwire Sentinel is a fantastic build. It's all designed about area control, moving enemies to disadvantageous positions, and as well being a good frontline fighter who has the ability to also do great crafting stuff. I mean, Inventor is so good because you are a really good Marshal. You're not a full Marshal, but it is something that you are still really good at. I mean, you get Master, which other Marshals get to, and you get crafting. You get crafting as you level up. And this isn't a video about Inventor. This is a video about the build, so let's get to it. So starting out with the stats, our main stat that we're going to be leveling up is going to be mostly Strength, followed by Intelligence. Now, Strength is going to be very important because we're going to be using a lot of Athletics. You're also a melee-based build. This is going to be using the Weapon Innovation, so having better accuracy is just going to improve your quality of play, and having a high Strength is going to make wearing heavier armors more easy. So, obviously, we're going to start with Strength. And Intelligence, obviously, because we're an Inventor and we use it for a lot of our things. Though it doesn't need to be the highest because you're going to be able to make most of your checks anyway, because your crafting skills automatically and level with you as you go up. So honestly, if your Intelligence doesn't start at 18, it's not quite a bad deal. And actually, speaking on that, the third set I'm going to recommend is going to be Con, but when we're starting out here, you're going to need at least a Dex of 14. And this for a couple reasons. First, you're going to need a Dex of 14 because we're going to be dipping into the Fighter Dedication pretty early, and you need a Dex of 14 and a Strength of 14. So, you know, that's obviously you need it in order to even participate in this build anyway. Secondly, because Inventor doesn't start off with heavy armor, wearing a medium armor that has a dex cap of +2 is honestly going to be a really good way to go about doing things. So this is good for your AC and a lot of other things starting out, though having a 14 dex plus getting as much strength as we can get does mean that your Intelligence is going to be at least a 16, and you might only start with like a 12 con. That's not a big issue, but that is the overall thing. And then as you're leveling up after that, you can throw Dex to the wayside. You don't need it anymore after that point, which means that this build becomes pretty flexible because as you're leveling up, obviously Strength, Dex, obviously Strength and Intelligence are important, Con as well, but you still have a fourth attribute you could be leveling up with everything, so that gives you some options for some skill choices you might make along the way. Speaking on skills, the main skill we're going to be leveling for this is Athletics. Simple as that. It's going to be a major part of this build. All you do is really push the enemy around, knock them over, steal their lunch money, all that kind of stuff. So Athletics is important. That does mean that you're going to be able to pick whatever other skills might work for your build, whether you want to go for Intimidation, whether you want to go for a good Diplomacy, heck, even if you want to go for something like Acrobatics, though I don't really recommend it, you could definitely do that with this build. And the great part about it is your Athletics and your crafting are going to level at the same rate. So you're going to have two skills at your highest skill proficiency as you level up through this build, which is going to be really, really good. It's awesome, honestly. All right, well, with all that said and done, let's get into the level ups. And at level 1, we're going to be taking the weapon innovation, which is important. The weapon innovation is paramount. Also, we're going to be taking the hampering innovation. Now, when I originally conceived this build, I was under the impression that you could not step out of difficult terrain. So the build was predominantly made around hampering an enemy square, forcing them to move so that you could then, use an attack of opportunity on them. That is not the case. You actually can step out of difficult terrain, and not only that, but you can move out of difficult terrain without spending any spaces. Hampering is still good though, and I'm going to show you why. Alright, so this is just from one of my games, so don't worry about it, but this is kind of the setup. So essentially, how hampering is going to help is, in a typical setting, if an enemy is either you step away from an enemy or you push or shove an enemy away, obviously you can't really use hampering because, let me be able to draw a square here, because when you do so, the enemy can just simply step to either side of your hampered square and still be able to attack you. And a big part of this build as well, I haven't mentioned it, is going to be using attack of opportunity, and it's going to be using a reach weapon. But hampering is still very important, and the reason why is based on how you're engaged with your enemies and based on certain kinds of situations. So for instance, if you're in this situation here and you shove the enemy away, then you use hampering with one of your other actions, which I gotta make another red square here. The enemy has no way to get to you without provoking an attack of opportunity, at least in a single action. Now, they could step twice, going one direction and then another direction, but that's 2 actions they're not hitting you, and that is a huge, loss of action efficiency in a round, which honestly is very worth it, especially for a single action to just create a square they can't get into. Now, they could step away and then stride to another ally, for instance. That's still 2 actions they're not using to beat up your ally. Now, another situation that can come up as well, if you're fighting an enemy, say like right here, and you shove them over here, and this corner of the tent counts as like an obstacle they can't go through. If you create a hampering square there, they must either step away and stride around to go to someone else, or do the whole second stride action again. So even if they are in that more disadvantageous right in front of you square, they are still needing to make extra actions as long as you can close off one of the surrounding squares to where you're at. So, that being the case, hampering is really good because it creates a situation where the enemy must either spend actions to do anything, or they must risk an attack of opportunity. And we'll get to the attack of opportunity here soon, but it's the precedent of the build, and this is kind of why I went with it. I just had to kind of change my initial idea on it, so hopefully that makes sense. So beyond that, your first level feat really is kind of up to you. I picked the variable core, as it allows you, when you use your explode action, to change the element away from fire in case an enemy is not fire resistant or has a weakness to another element. I felt that was more helpful, especially with this build where you're designed to be right in the thick of things with enemies around. So this is just the one I'd recommend, but whatever floats your boat. Honestly, it's not super important to the build. At level 2, we're going to be getting into the Fighter Dedication. Now, the Fighter Archetype multiclass dedication, that's a big mouthful, is okay. The initial dedication feat doesn't really do anything. You just become trained in acrobatics or athletics. Obviously, we're already trained in athletics, so you're going to become trained in acrobatics whether you want to or not. If you happen to be trained in acrobatics, though, you do get a skill trained proficiency of your choice, which is interesting. You also become trained in fighter DCs. Not super important, but, still, it's not the level 2 we're after. It's at level 4. We're going to pick up Opportunist, which gives us access to attack of opportunity. This is where the build really comes in because you are a threat to everyone within your reach. Having a reach weapon is very important for this build, so your innovation does need to be a reach weapon. And I do recommend a reach weapon that does not have the piercing trait because the hampering innovation allows you to have versatile piercing. So if you have slashing, it just expands your damage portfolio. It's really good, or your damage profile, I should say, which is really, really good. And it allows you to hurt more enemies that have certain kinds of weaknesses, or maybe specific kinds of resistances. Regardless, picking up Opportunist is a big part of the build, but we're not done with Fighter yet. At level 6, we're going to pick up the basic Maneuver archetype feat, and we're going to pick up Brutish Shove, which is very important because what it allows you to do is, as long as you have a multi-attack penalty, because this has the press trait, you can make a strike, and if it hits, the enemy becomes flat-footed until the end of your turn, and you can automatically shove them. This is a really good maneuver overall because it puts an enemy in a really bad situation when it comes to dealing with you, as I mentioned, or as I shown you before. And on top of that, this is just a really solid way. And you don't even need to actually make the athletics check to shove the enemy in this way. It's overall a very solid way to go about doing this build. And at level 6, or no, sorry, at level 8, we're going to be picking up Powerful Shove, which allows you to shove a creature that are 2 sizes larger than you. Now, this does, because you don't actually make a shove action, the enemy is just shoved, or it takes the effect of shove. I don't believe Titan Wrestler works. Whether it does or does not, you don't need Titan Wrestler now because you're going to have access to Powerful Shove, which allows you to push a bigger enemy. And not only that, but if an enemy would, by being shoved, hit a obstacle for whatever reason, they take damage equal to your strength modifier, which is very good and our reason why we're boosting our strength as well. And on top of this, I didn't mention this with Brutish Shove, but Brutish Shove has a failure condition. So even if you miss, the enemy still remains flat-footed to you until the end of your turn, which means you can Hail Mary go for a third attack, and they are still going to be at least a -8 to hit rather than a -10, which is at least something. It's very good, and overall, these feats all make up what we're picking up from Fighter and are very much the focus of the build because they allow us to push the enemy around, deal some damage, and not only that, but get attack of opportunity, which is paramount for the build. Now, I did skip over level 7 talking about Powerful Shove, but at level 7, we're picking up the breakthrough modification of Entangling Form, and what this does is it gives our weapon the trip and grapple traits, which is really good and will put your athletics to use, as now you can further manipulate enemies, either forcing them to not move unless they get through your athletics DC, or being able to trip them, and then they have to stand, which provokes attack of opportunity, which is really bad for them in this build. Overall, it works super solidly. Now, at level 10, we're actually going to be picking up the Sentinel Archetype Dedication because this allows you to frontline a little bit better by allowing you to get heavy armor proficiency. And not only that, but as you level up your other armor proficiencies, heavy armor goes up as well. And considering Inventor gets up to medium, that means that you will become eventually a master in heavy armor, which is really solid. Now, at level 12, we're picking up Megaton Strike. This is a really good feat because it's essentially a powerful strike only for inventors, and you can use its unstable function to do some more damage. But what's even better is that we're going to get Gigaton Strike at level 14, which is going to allow us to shove enemies back based on a fortitude save against our class DC when we strike them with our unstable Megaton Strike. It's a really, really good feature, works well with this build, and it's a lot better than Brutish Shove, honestly. And because of this, you don't necessarily need Brutish Shove or Powerful Shove even into your build anymore, though allowing you to retrain out of them if you deem fit, though they do still serve some really good purposes. Obviously, Brutish Shove flatfoots an enemy even if you miss with it, and Powerful Shove does do the extra damage when you shove an enemy into a wall, and you do need Brutish Shove to get into it. So, obviously, you probably don't want to retrain out of those necessarily, but it's just an option if you want some more flexibility in your build. And I do gotta say, at this point, we get a lot of good combat maneuvers, good athletics, and everything, and we're still an inventor. We can still make things in our downtime, which gives you a good amount of utility during downtime. And not only that, but you still have another skill proficiency that you're leveling up at this time that could be really high, meaning that you still have some other options, whether you want to go for deception for fainting, intimidation for demoralize, or whether you want some more out of combat utility like society or any of the other intelligence based recall knowledge checks that you could use on enemies in combat. Overall, this build just offers so much in the way of being a tank, being utility, and doing some decent damage on the battlefield. At level 15, we're actually going to pick up the incredible innovation of Extensible Weapon, increasing our reach weapons range from a 5-foot reach to a 10-foot reach, which is nuts. It allows you to cover a bigger area, and not only that, I didn't mention this before, but because we have the weapon innovation, we actually get the critical specialization. And considering that most pole arms are reach weapons, you're more than likely going to be used the polearm critical specialization, which means that when you critical an enemy, you can forcibly move them to a square, 5 feet within your range. This allows you to, if you crit on your first hit, move an enemy 5 feet away. It's so good. It's just one of those things that makes this build work really, really well. An extensible weapon further allows us to manipulate the battlefield. And with hampering, we can work around the environment. If enemies are positioned correctly, we can even force them to make multiple actions to even hurt us or an ally, give or take. There's just so many things that this build does really, really well, and it makes you a serious hindrance to enemies on the battlefield, and you're still getting the damage in. You're still doing really well, and you still got good utility. I just absolutely love this build. At 16th level, we're actually going to be picking up the Armor Specialist from the Sentinel Dedication to allow us to get the armor specialization for probably plate armor, allowing you, I believe it gives you resistance to slashing damage, if I'm not mistaken, which is pretty good. Extra resistance, extra tankiness, overall pretty solid. At level 18, we're picking up Mighty Bulwark from the Sentinel Dedication, which allows us to enhance the Bulwark benefit to our reflex saves. And considering we're wearing heavy armor, all of the better, honestly. It just makes us more defensible. It's a really good feat overall. Honestly, if you're not as concerned about your survivability, I'm sure there are some other good fighter feats that you could pick up with Advanced Maneuver or even Inventor feats if you want to add a little bit more or more like inventoriness into your kit. But for the Sentinel build that I've designed anyway, having extra tankiness only helps. And at 20th level, we're picking up Full Automation, which gives us a quicken action to strike with our weapon every round. This is really good because what it does is it allows you to get an attack off so that you could use Brutish Shove. And if Brutish Shove fails, you could still have other actions to work around. Or if you, don't have, or if you have your Gigaton Impact already set up, you can hit an enemy with it. They more than likely will be pushed away from you. You could step back and you can still hamper a square next to them, making their life utterly miserable when it comes to trying to get to you. It's just, Full Automation just really works with the build perfectly, and it's a really solid pick overall for a level 20 feat especially. Now, for the archetype, if you're using the bonus archetype rule, which I recommend everyone does because it's a really good rule, it really works well with this build. It allows you to pick up those Sentinel feats earlier, which gives you a little bit more flexibility on what you actually want to pick as far as your feats could go. You can even pick up the Construct Companion early on with your level 1 and then swap out your feats there with the improvements to the Construct Companion, which is really good, honestly. Another very viable way of going about doing it. But for some other archetypes that I recommend with the build, Mauler, of course, you're using a two-handed weapon. It just makes complete sense, allowing you to do things like tripping enemies on a successful strike. There's just so many really good feats in the Mauler that just work too good with the Steelwire Sentinel. Bleh. Overwatch is another surprisingly really good one, actually. There's a lot of feats here that, honestly, I could go into but make the video super long, but The Overwatch allows you to provide initiative bonuses to your team. You can even do things like giving allies a bonus or swapping an ally's AC with your perception DC, which is really interesting. And you even get master perception using this Overwatch archetype as well, which I don't know if the Inventor gets or not. I don't really mind to look all too much. You can either pick it up to make it better or not. Either way, it's still really good, and it makes a good support battlefield kind of control build. I absolutely love it for the Steelwire Sentinel. Why is this so hard to say? I made it. Last but not least on the archetype recommendations is going to be Marshal, because if you're going to be the center of the battlefield, giving all kinds of bonuses and working on the front line, might as well give some bonuses. And with those skill increases that I mentioned that are pretty much free with this anyway, you could go Dread Marshal, or you could go the morale boosting Marshal if you really want to. There's so many really good ways that Marshal can fit into this build. Now, I don't do gear with a lot of my builds, mostly because a lot of them don't really need it, or it's not overly necessary to dictate what kind of items players use, but I do recommend the Glaive as your reach weapon for this build. It's a slashing weapon, which I mentioned how that stacks with the hampering, piercing versatility, but not only that, this is forceful, and you are likely to be striking an enemy multiple times with this weapon, so forceful stacks really, really well. Not only that, I do recommend picking up the Extending Rune, because why not be even more of a nuisance and be able to strike enemies 60 feet or 120 feet away with your amped up innovation weapon? I mean, seriously, come on. And because you have the critical specialization of pole arms, you can even knock a flying enemy down at least a little bit closer to the ground. It's overall a really good rune pickup for this build. Other than that, Armbands of Athleticism, I think, is a pretty big no-brainer. Now, you do get grapple and trip with the build, so you don't really need the item bonus it gives, but you can get it for athleticism, and it has some other benefits as well. And you can use it for like your shove if you're just doing a normal shove action for whatever reason, or if it's to determine your athletics DC for certain kind of checks, like to break out of your grapple. It is just overall really, really good to pick up. Now, we're here at the end of the build, and this one was not as long as some of the other builds. I feel like a lot of it is pretty self-explanatory, but my Ancestry and Heritage choices for this one, honestly, Steelskin Hobgoblin works with this build almost a little too well. It blends in with a lot of combat utility you can pick up, whether you want to even go like field medic or whether you want to go with morale boosting, all kinds of stuff like that. Hobgoblin actually has a lot of that in spades. It makes really good, and Hobgoblins just make really good straight frontline fighters that are really good for your team. Or if you want to take a more interesting approach, I think the Automaton Sentinel would be very interesting. You can skin so many of the Inventor feats just with Automaton features, and even skin some of the Automaton Ancestry features with your inventoriness working on your own body, that I think it blends in perfectly, honestly. It makes this build really cool, and the idea of a really cool robot person who is this big juggernaut on the field controlling where enemies go and all that kind of stuff just seems like peak fantasy. But with that, we're going to be done with the build here. Hopefully you all enjoyed. Thank you all so much for watching. I actually really like this build. I did learn something new. I've been using a rule wrong, but you know, I learned, and I learned before the video came out, which I think is a win for all of us, really, honestly. But with that, thank you all so much for watching. Good luck with your games. Leave the bad luck to me, and I'll see you all next time. Bye.